Hold on a second.
No problem. And Helen, while you do that, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We are so excited to see a full house of 75 participants. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Fighting for Inclusive Curriculum. We are going to talk about what it means to fight for inclusive curriculum. What is inclusive curriculum? And so many other different avenues in which we can go about curriculum advocacy and education advocacy in the state and in the city. And we are so proud to be joined by our champions, Senator John Liu, and soon Assemblymember Grace Lee, who will share remarks in a little bit. But let's go ahead and get started first. Next slide, please. I am Felicia Singh, Director of Policy and Government Relations at CACF, and we are also joined by our policy team member, Kulsum Tapal, our Education Policy Coordinator. CACF was founded in 1986, and our mission and our focus is advocacy for children and families. We are the nation's only Pan-Asian children and families advocacy organization, bringing together community-based organizations as well as youth community members to fight for equity for Asian American Pacific Islanders. Our mission, of course, is to advocate for equity and opportunity for marginalized API children and families, as well as doing that in solidarity with other marginalized groups. Our vision, of course, is for all children and families, including APIs, to be living in a safe, healthy, thriving, and full life. And we do that work through our policy change work, which we'll talk about that in a moment. Our focus for CACF's education equity agenda come in many different forms. We think about how we're included and seen and our identities are present in inclusive admissions and enrollment practices, in data disaggregation, so that agencies, government stakeholders, and our communities can understand diverse needs among API students and families, through our culturally responsive teaching and learning, which we'll talk about today, equity for English language learners, equity for students with disabilities, as well as support for family engagement, mental health, and well-being. I'm going to pass it on to Kulsum, who's going to start us off with making sure that we have a base understanding of what exactly is inclusive curriculum.
Everyone, so good to see new faces as well as folks who have been in this fight with us for a minute. So really excited to get started. We're going to start with the basics. I think if you're here attending this briefing to some extent, I think we have some sort of understanding that inclusive curriculum is important, right? And there are a lot of things we've been engaging with our community members. CACF, we run a youth program, ASAP, and we've spoken to a lot of students through that program. And a lot of our partner organizations and REACH members at large have spoken to us about why do they care about inclusive curriculum, right? Why do we care about AANHPI curriculum? And some key things that we've heard is that we believe that having an inclusive curriculum will help support addressing hate-based bullying by addressing a root cause for misunderstanding and stereotypes, confront the erasure of our communities by fostering space for healthy identity development, just having an understanding of our own histories, our own selves, right? And the ways that we, our ancestors and our communities have come up together. And that plays into that solidarity piece. And then also just knowing our history, our real history, will prepare us for our workplaces, for our communities, for us to better build community with one another. These are just some of the reasons that we really understand inclusive curriculum to be really important. And we'll talk a little bit about like what do we mean when we say inclusive curriculum. I also want to take a moment to say that inclusive curriculum is essentially when we think about curriculum in the classroom, right now there's a narrative, right? And that narrative often excludes historically marginalized communities. And it could be argued that that is done intentionally in some ways. And so what does it look like for us to confront that head on? And so that's a little bit on its importance. And if you are familiar with CACF's work or REACH's work, you know that we've been the front lines pushing for the teaching of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander history to be taught in the classroom in schools. But we also understand, and in doing that work, we've been in community and in conversation and partnership with organizations and community members that are both within the AANHPI community as well as other historically marginalized communities. And our conversations and our collaboration across communities has shown us very clearly that we cannot advance and implement an AANHPI curriculum without pushing for a broader inclusive curriculum strategy. That these two efforts really do go hand in hand, and hopefully we'll illustrate a little bit more in a minute about the political landscape that exists, right? The possible strategies that are available to us and what it looks like for us to actually move that forward. But before I get into it, and I apologize in advance, it's like throwback to school, but we're talking about curriculum, so hopefully people feel ready to take this on. I wanted to share a few definitions because when we talk about curriculum advocacy, I think it can be a little bit of a daunting space to enter because there's a lot of words used that we all don't have shared understanding on, which is totally okay. So just as we move forward, we're going to say the word curriculum a lot. So I just want to define it. It is the content that we're advocating to be taught in the classroom. This is different from a lesson plan, which is the daily plan that an instructor uses to actually implement the content. And then the last thing that I'm going to mention is a framework, which is the culturally responsive sustaining education framework. This is a framework that has been introduced and endorsed by the New York State Education Department. And it helps educators create a student-centered learning environment to affirm students' various diverse identities. And implementing this framework allows for AANHPI curriculum to actually be taught in the classroom, as well as Black studies to be taught in the classroom, and Latina history to be taught in all of these communities that have been historically marginalized and excluded from curriculum to be taught. And so the next here, I'm gonna show you, because sometimes it's easy to talk about things, but what does it actually mean in the classroom? And so I won't read through all of these, but I'm just gonna share like a couple of examples, because CRSC can show up across subjects. So not just social studies, although today we are going to focus on social studies, but just want to demonstrate what it looks like to have a truly expansive, culturally responsive classroom environment. And that could look like as simple as when a student is learning math, maybe the charts and the tables that the students are working their workbook problems with is talking about racial representation of characters in popular TV shows, right? Or in social studies class, when students are learning about immigrant neighborhoods in their communities, they're able to talk to their own families about immigration experiences and compare themes and concepts. So these are some examples. Another small but very important example is the types of books that exist in the classroom. Who are the authors that are writing those books, right? Who are the characters that the main leads in those books? Those are all examples of a CRSC classroom. So now we're going to dive into the current landscape in New York State. This is where we're going to really talk through, like, what does it look like for us to move this work forward, right? And who do we need to work with to move this work forward? So the first thing is the levers of change, okay? To be able to change the system, you have to know the system. And so I'm just going to name some of these things. We have the New York State Assembly. And we'll have Assemblymember Grace Lee present, who will be able to share more about her leadership there. We have the New York State Senate, where we will hear from Senator John Liu in a minute about his leadership there as well. We have the New York State Regents. They dictate a lot about the ways that the New York State Education Department operates. This is separate from the Regents exam, just same word. But these are important figures, right, that have a lot of say in the way our school system operates. We have the governor's office. This is the executive. So there is say that comes from the governor's side as well. We see that in our budget advocacy fights every year, right? As an example. And then coming to the city level, we have the New York City Council, which also has the ability to pass bills, pass resolutions and things like that. We have the New York City Department of Education that mirrors the New York State Education Department, which is also listed next to it. And then the last lever of change listed here is UFT, which is the largest teachers union in the state. Obviously understanding educators' perspectives is really important in knowing how best we can implement curriculum, because we can talk about implementing curriculum, but we also need the resources and the professional development necessary to actually make that happen. And so these are some of the key levers of change, and each lever of change has a slightly different power, right? They can do different things and they often work together. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to name them to start with. And then the next thing here is we're going to name some power players, right? These are figures to know. These are figures that have a lot of say in our education system. And we have the governor, the New York State Education Department commissioner, New York City mayor, the DOE chancellor. I know I'm naming a lot. Well, you'll receive information. You'll receive these slides too. You don't have to like memorize these names and titles right now. But just to share that there are a lot of folks, right? There are a lot of important committees present, a lot of different levers of change to move on, and a lot of different folks to speak with, to work together with, to make this happen. So we'll now, I think now that we've kind of talked about key players, I want to introduce two key players. We'll start by introducing Senator John Liu, and we'd love to open space, and I'll actually stop sharing screen in a moment so we can kind of all see one another, and just give him the space to talk a little bit about what we've seen so far in the Senate and in this fight for inclusive curriculum, and what the journey ahead looks like, and how we can kind of work together to make this happen. So I'll stop sharing.
I don't know what it is, but I'm not hot anymore.
Am I up?
Maybe it's because it's cold.
Yeah.
All right, well, it's great to see everybody here. I'm happy we have such a great turnout, and it's such an important topic for all of us. I think Helen mentioned it well at the beginning. We all know the extreme anti-Asian hate that coincided with the pandemic. And, there's people calling for stronger hate crime laws, throwing people in jail longer, having more enforcement. That's all fine and dandy, but it's always been my firm belief that we want to fight anti-Asian hate. We have to have people see us more as Americans and even humans, get rid of the model minority myth, get rid of the perpetual foreigner syndrome. And that the only way to do that long-term is education, teaching our school kids and future generations that Asian Americans are as important a part of this country as anybody else, really. I mean, 150 years at this point. So the fight has been to mandate the teaching of Asian American history, what I call the Asian American experience, because it's not just about history. It's really like, to me, the experience encompasses more. And how do we do that? And many of you have been part of the REACH coalition that has been working to craft legislation to ensure that in New York State, we mandate that this teaching across all public schools. We didn't succeed the first year of the REACH coalition, which was at this point, I guess it was 2 years ago. And then in the second year, we had some success by passing it in the state Senate, although it was a weaker version of what the REACH coalition originally envisioned. And it still has yet to pass the state assembly. And I know Grace has been working very hard on that front. So, I think there's been so we've had some limited success, although I think legislatively, this is in New York far more than anybody else has ever achieved. So let me explain what that means. There are other states, I think people mentioned Illinois, people mentioned New Jersey, a couple other states where there has been Asian American history mandated in state law. Those examples that we have seen are merely the addition of Asian American or AAPI or some version of this, this description of our collective community, the addition of our community to an existing list of histories that are required to be taught in public schools. So for example, state X will say, public schools must teach the history of African Americans, of Latino Americans, of Jewish Americans, and there's usually a list that's existing already, but it never included Asian or AAPI, and so AAPI got added to that list. Here in New York, we don't have that list. We've never had such a list. And in fact, our African American colleagues in the state legislature in both houses have long championed legislation that would require the teaching of African American history in public schools. Our Latinx members have had similar legislation, and they've had it much longer than we've been proposing this AAPI history or experience to be included in public schools. But none of their bills have ever passed. And so it doesn't seem totally fulfilling, but the reality is that, we have a bill that is a little bit weaker than what was originally proposed by the Reach Coalition, but it did pass one chamber. We're trying to get it, once you pass it in one chamber, it kind of becomes the hook to pass it in the other chamber. So we're trying to get that passed. Now, some people are contemplating, well, do we want to just get the original version passed, which has more teeth and has more impact? I'd love to, but that kind of legislation has never passed in the state of New York because the education structure is different from the other states. Education is not something that is run by the federal government. You see, this, I don't want to get too partisan here. I'm just not happy with what happened the last couple of weeks, but the guy who's going to be in charge wants to eliminate the Department of Education. So education is a state responsibility. It is not a power that's been delegated by the states to the federal government. That's why states pay for education. The federal government doesn't pay for education. And so it's always enacted at the state level. But in New York, we're structured different than those other states that have these lists that AAPI were added to. So if we had a list, you can imagine how easily and quickly we could legislate the addition of AAPI experience in history to a list that includes African American history, Latinx history, and the history of other racial and other communities. But we don't have that. But we are leading, our African American colleagues, I think Grace can attest to this also, are saying, hey, how did you guys pass that legislation? We want our bill passed, something like that as well. So if you ask me about the political climate and the situation right now, the last couple of years, we were able to pass not the best version, but a pretty decent version of the legislation in the Senate, trying to get it passed. And it's not just on Grace, I help her also. She helps me in the Senate. We try to get that passed in the Assembly as well. I've seen, I guess, Shang, what's the name of that other coalition? They circulated a letter.
Make us
Okay.
visible.
Make us visible.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I knew that. I think all the members of the Reach Coalition, you signed a letter that is demanding a stronger version of the legislation, which legislation that I would love to see passed. The question is, can that even see the light of day? And so now there's potentially two pieces of legislation. And, I can tell you from experience, when there's two pieces of legislation like this, that most other legislators, I hate to say it, don't really care about, then you wind up killing both pieces of legislation, as opposed to having, a menu from colleagues to choose from. So there's a couple of things that we can do as a coalition or as stakeholders in this. You can all be much more forceful with your state representatives. I think the people who have been part of the REACH coalition, they have done a lot. But we had a rally in Albany, and, depending on who we ask, we either had 50 people there or 30 people there. I'm sorry to say, that is not going to make an impression on our colleagues who don't really care about this. Grace cares deeply about this. I care deeply about this. We got to trade a lot of other things. We got to give support for things that we don't want necessarily. But this is the legislative process when you have 150 assembly members and 63 state senators. So I think, I thank Felicia and Kulsum for describing us as your champions. You can say we are champions, and I've always considered myself to be a foot soldier in the AAPI cause. That's why I ran for office in the first place. So it's a matter of how angry you're all going to be and how much effort you're going to put into lobbying, coercing, and maybe even badgering all the state reps that to support this legislation. And knowing that the first thing they're going to say to you is, we haven't even passed African-American history mandates. We haven't even passed Latin American history mandates. You got to be prepared for that and say, well, nowhere better to start than AAPI history. Let's get this bill legislated. So that's what I would have said last year, and I did say this last year. Now this year, we've lost 2 members in the state Senate. So, Kevin Thomas was not able to run for re-election. And unfortunately, my sister Ewan did not make it. Now, she was replaced by another Chinese American member. And I'm not trying to be partisan here, but he's a Republican. He's not going to have any say in this. I'm not trying to diss Republicans. That is how it works. Not just in New York, in every state. That's how it works in the federal government. So in the Democratic caucus of the state Senate, we went from 4 members to 2 members. It's just me and Jeremy now. So our situation is a little bit weaker than last year. The state assembly, I don't think we've made any gains. Shane just came in and told me I'm talking too much, so I'll stop here. But that is the lay of the land, no filter, no sugarcoating. And if we want to get shit done, then you got to be angry and serious about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Liu. And I think hopefully we're on track to doing just that. We're about to talk about what we have planned for the year. But before we get to it, I'm really excited to introduce Assemblymember Grace Lee, who will share a little bit on what's going on the Assembly side. Yeah, I will pass it over to her. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Great to see all of you. And Kulsum, thank you for putting this together. Thank you to CACF. It's amazing to see all of this incredibly broad coalition coming together for this legislation. I just want to say, I know that, we're looking at just the disappointment of not being able to move this bill forward in the last 2 years. And that's, for the term that I've been the sponsor on the bill. But I do want to highlight the incredible work this coalition has done to achieve a lot of things for the Asian American community in the last 2 years. You know, whether it's record funding in the budget, $30 million, 2 years in a row for Asian-led, Asian-serving organizations, to funding RE in the budget, state budget for the first time in the history of the state. You know, also getting 2 school holidays, Lunar New Year and Diwali, recognized at the state. You know, I think that these are incredible accomplishments. So we should be celebrating each of those wins along the way, you know, as we are continuing our fight for inclusive curriculum. I think that's really important because these fights can take a long time, and we have to make sure that we are also celebrating the achievements that we're making. And a lot of that is coming because we have been such a solid coalition. And speaking to John's point about how there are now other groups trying to break off and to do something different, I think that really does endanger our ability to be successful. The reason why we have been able to be so successful with the state budget year after year is because we do it together as a coalition. We come together and we fight together. So, you know, that's something that I think that we need to continue to think about and remember as we move forward with this. The other thing that I wanted to say is that the work that you all have been doing has been some of the most inspiring work that I've seen in Albany and that I've been able to be a part of. So I want to thank you, because the organizing that I've seen from young people, the activism that I've seen from young people who want to see inclusive curriculum in their schools has been incredible. And so when we talk about how are we going to engage Asian American community, how are we going to engage young people in government and in politics, this is the way we do it, by leading with legislation that reflects them, where they can see their government and, you know, advocating for things that are important to them. And I think that you guys have all done just an incredible job to, you know, bring young people up to Albany, get them involved. You know, speaking on the podium for the first time, you know, like that's a hard thing. And, you know, it's been like a really inspiring part of this journey. So I want to thank you all for that. And I think there's a lot of really great work, I think, that is really going to come out of this journey that we have together to get this legislation passed. I think John has spoken a lot about the hurdles that we're facing. I agree that, you know, when, you know, Jennifer Rajkumar wanted Diwali passed as a New York City holiday, they came in bus loads and bus loads over and over again. You know, like that's, you know, the kind of energy that I think that we do need to see and try to match heading into the next couple of legislative sessions, so, you know, especially this one. So, you know, I welcome that kind of engagement and activity. I think that also that sometimes these start as grassroots movements before they get to a statewide level. And we saw that, you know, with, I will give, you know, use Lunar New Year as an example, where Lunar New Year didn't start as a statewide school holiday. It started as a local New York City holiday, and then it began to get recognized in other counties. And then it paved the way for New York State to do it on a statewide level. So with the curriculum, what we're seeing now is not only that New York City has adopted inclusive curriculum with Asian American history and an incredible textbook as well, which we should all be really excited about, but pushing to make sure that other counties are doing the same. You know, making sure that we're getting the momentum and meeting the demand in other counties and other school systems. So we can say, look, this school system's already doing it. This school system's already doing it. We're doing it here. Why don't we make this a statewide movement? So, you know, I think that also thinking about how we can energize groups outside of New York City to really be pushing for inclusive curriculum, I think that's really important. I think that one thing that we've been successful on with the budget, state budget, is being very inclusive of not just New York City organization, but statewide organizations, and demonstrating the need and for the funding not just in New York City, but out of New York City. Because we can't just do this, as John said, with the limited number of AAPI legislators we have. We need to build a broad coalition amongst elected officials. And they will advocate for it if they see that it's something that is important to their district. So building broad coalitions outside of New York City, I think, are going to be really imperative to the progress that we make. So yeah, I think that those are, some of the things I know it's hard, and we're going to have to work really hard this year on a lot of things. We're going to have to work really hard for the funding again in the state budget. We're going to have to work really hard on a lot of other issues impacting our community, especially given where the new president and his threats to immigrant communities and across the country. So there's like a lot of fights that we have to have. So we got to stay focused. We got to stay unified. And make sure we're bringing the energy to Albany. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember. I think we are, both Senator Liu and Assemblymember Grace Lee have really set the stage for what we're about to talk about next, which is our political landscape. Because what I shared earlier remains true. You got to know the system to fight the system. So I hope you all can, yes, I think you can see my screen.
Yes.
So we are going to move right along. So I wanted to, we talk about like going hard, right? Fighting, we have to show up to Albany. What does it actually look like to show up? What are we asking people to show up to? Like, that's kind of what we want to spend this time talking about and sharing candidly, right? Like, what are the different, there was some really healthy conversation in the chat about like different strategies and what does it look like for us to come together to fight for this in a united way. I think that's what it is we're going to have to fight for this together. And so we want to share a little bit of like from our research, from talking to a lot of folks, what does that look like? So these are some possible avenues of change that I just want to name. And I use the word possible very loosely, possible in the sense that it could happen. And then there are different political environments that make some strategies more possible than other strategies, depending on the moment we're in, right? But I just want to name them so we are kind of all on the same page. There's a mandate via legislation, right? Which we talked about. We talked about how the mandate is no longer present in the legislation, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. We could do a funded mandate to the state budget. So if the governor decides this is a #1 priority for her tomorrow, she could allocate funding towards it theoretically, right? And that would push a really strong direction. If there's money for something, something's going to happen. And similarly, if the New York State Education Department chooses to, they could pursue a path to updating New York State learning standards that compel the inclusion of inclusive curriculum in the classroom, right? If there are different standards that are pushing for that. Regents, who I mentioned earlier, the folks who kind of oversee and have a lot of say on the way NYSED operates, they can also establish rules that affect the way the state education department operates. That can influence the way curriculum mandates are implemented or enforced. And then same with funding requests I mentioned with the governor, but there's also, NYSED has a set pocket of funding every year. Regents approve some of those funding requests and have some say or have the capacity to have a say on where that funding can be directed. And then the last one is individual school districts actually can mandate curriculum as long as it is in line with the New York State Education Learning Standards. So these are some possible avenues, right? And we'll explore why some are more viable than others, and like what are the strategies that Reach is moving forward with. And again, like we're talking about inclusive curriculum, right? So we're not exclusively talking about AANHPI curriculum. And so in lieu of that, we want to share first, like what are some different landscapes, right? So there's the legislative landscape. And this is what our champion shared a little earlier, right? There's no precedent yet of a curriculum mandate passing in New York State. So that's one thing to know in terms of moving legislation forward. There have been proposed state legislation in various curricular efforts, which we'll share some examples in the next slide. Also want to share that currently in the New York State legislature, there is a culture that states that curriculum legislation with a mandate cannot pass. And this culture is reinforced by conversations with New York State Education Department, right? And so we'll talk about that. We also, in the context of the state legislative landscape, want to share that REACH and CACF, we've been in communication with folks across the country to learn on their fights, how they've moved their bills forward. And it is true, I think Senator Liu mentioned this, different states have different current realities, right? And so New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, like we've spoken to all of them to understand like, what did it look like for you to move this forward? Some of those bills had implementation language, stronger implementation language than others. Some of those bills had mandates, some didn't. So these are some varying points, right? And then in the broader scope of a culturally responsive curriculum, which we mentioned earlier, right? An all-inclusive curriculum. I also want to acknowledge that there are a lot of states that are moving forward with ethnic studies, which is a broader lens, but definitely in the same, I would say, arena as inclusive curriculum, right? And so just very briefly, these are some bills, not all of them, that we feel highlight different components that collectively could allow for the implementation of true inclusive curriculum in the classroom if they were to be implemented. So this is just to demonstrate like the different communities that are doing this work and the different legislations active, and this is not even all of it. So the next thing I want to talk about is the agency landscape. So we just talked about the legislative landscape, and you heard a little bit from our champions on kind of the climate there. The agency, we want to talk, kind of debunk New York State Education Department to the extent that we can, right? So understanding that right now from our conversations with various electeds that we've spoken to on Advocacy Day and different occasions, we've heard straightforward that NYSED is advising these a lot of elected folks, officials to kind of vote against or not uplift curriculum legislation. There's perhaps a myriad of reasons as to why that's happening, right? Concerns around funding, potentially, concerns around actually what would happen if a bill like this were to pass. All of those things are in bucket A, but the fact in front of us is that that is the dynamic right now present that we're noticing. Something to note, just in terms of how things operate, is that New York State's Education Department sets the standards that educators must teach to. And then they can identify curricular resources, which are textbooks, that school districts can use. But the school districts are ultimately responsible for developing and selecting the curriculum that they want to use, as long as it aligns with the standards, which is why we highlighted modifying potentially the standards as one way that we could move towards implementing more inclusive curriculum in the classroom. And then a key fact I want to share is that, you know, we know that last year NYSED did request some funding from the regents to implement CRSC, and this request was denied. So this also demonstrates a internal culture in terms of prioritization amongst the agency at this moment. Again, there might be various reasons for why that happened, but this is also a fact, right? We'll move along to the New York City political environment, and we'll bring all of this together in a moment. So I know this is kind of a lot, perhaps. But moving from the state to the city level, understanding that the city has actually kicked off a new curriculum mandate, demonstrating that it's possible. It's possible that a city can instate a curricular mandate, and schools are currently being expected to join this effort and implement it. And I'm not saying that this is a seamless process. There's a lot happening. There's professional development happening. There's funding accompanied with this mandate. There are a lot of things happening, but just to demonstrate that there is a sort of precedent of curricular mandate happening, be it in terms of improving literacy. Other things wanting to note, Black Studies is currently being piloted in New York City, funded by the city. Latinx Studies is also coming funded by the city. These are really exciting projects that are being piloted. CACF is really excited that we're on the advisory board supporting the Black Studies efforts. And so these are just some ways that we know that curriculum is actively being developed to ensure that our various communities are uplifted. It's just about what does it take to actually get the curriculum that's being developed to actually make it into the classroom, to actually be taught in the classrooms, and not just by the teachers who are self-selecting themselves to teach it, but so all classrooms are teaching this material, right? So that's kind of where we're approaching this from. In line with curriculum and content that's being developed is the Hidden Voices curriculum, which is a curricular resource developed by the Department of Education. You may have heard about it and you may have thought, oh, AAPI curriculum is happening. So I wanted to name that because that's not necessarily true. It's true that Hidden Voices, a curricular resource, is being developed, and it's being developed to uplift African-American diaspora voices, Latinx voices, LGBTQ voices, AAPI voices. However, none of these curricular resources are mandated, which means, and from our conversations with the DOE, we know that what they do is they put a lot of energy and resources, and they do work with a lot of community orgs and folks in the community or subject matter experts to develop this resource. But then there is very little resourcing and effort put into the implementation. So what we've heard from anecdotally from a lot of educators, parents, principals in our network is that we didn't even know that this existed. But from the DOE's end, we hear that, well, we sent a box of these books to every school in New York City. And so there's an active gap between this resource being developed and this resource actually being implemented. The other active gap is that we talked to DOE, we said, okay, you sent these books, but a lot of these educators didn't learn AAPI history in the classroom. So they need professional development to be equipped to teaching this content in the classroom. That is also currently not something that a lot of resourcing or time is being put into. So these are some gaps and just like current realities in the New York City political environment. There's things to look forward to, just the fact that these resources are being developed, which is really great, and things that we need to push for. And the last thing I'll uplift that just happened last week, which is really exciting, is that the religious diversity curriculum resolution passed in New York City. And there are a lot of folks on this call that I see that helped make this happen. This is another demonstration that folks in the city and in the state believe that inclusive curriculum is something that's important. It's worth fighting for. I know that this resolution is something that folks have been fighting for 3+ years. It's just the beginning, right, to ensure that diverse voices are heard in the classroom. And the last thing I'll note in terms of landscape analysis is our advocacy landscape. This is all of us here on this call, which I'm really excited to see everyone. So we have a number of AAPI organizations and folks, and I know Assemblymember Lee mentioned we have such amazing students that show up and have continued to shape the way we operate. And that's a really amazing place to be in, that we're all here together talking to one another, making this happen. The other really amazing thing about our advocacy landscape is that we have a lot of communities and relationships across communities. And there's also a history in this city and in this state for advocating for inclusive curriculum. There's a lot of folks who've been doing this for a really long time. And that I think is a strength to learn from. So these are some things, just wanted to paint the picture, which will help inform where we go next. So without further ado, I jumped the screen a little bit, but I want to introduce folks at the SIG Coalition who will be representing REACH Coalition and talking a little bit about our work there and talking about our strategy to come.
Thanks, Kulsum. Hi, everyone. Savleen Singh, she, her pronouns, Senior Education Manager with the SIG Coalition. Joined with me is my amazing colleague, Harmeet Kaur Kamboj, Senior State Policy Manager at the SIG Coalition. Can go to the next slide. So just to introduce the REACH Coalition, Senator Liu, thank you so much for introducing us a little bit earlier. And Assemblymember Lee, thank you so much for joining us and for being champions on our bills. The REACH Coalition, which stands for Representing and Empowering AANHPI Communities in History, we've been dedicated to ensuring AAPI AANHPI histories are taught in school. We work through advocacy and collaboration to create inclusive, culturally responsive curriculums that will reflect the diversity, as well as the contributions of all the communities in New York. Some of the values, as you see on screen, our approach centers on solidarity and intersectionality, breaking down barriers like the model minority myth, and we lead with transparency, ensuring a community-informed, there's a community-informed process and clear communications of successes and needs. And by integrating culturally responsive and sustaining education into our advocacy, we also uplift curriculum efforts across other communities to build collective progress. So some of the amazing organizations that are included in the steering committee of the REACH Coalition. So I'll let you guys just take a look and we can move along. In the recent years, there's been a growing effort to address the underrepresentation of Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander history in our schools. And the journey so far has been aimed at making AANHPI history an integral part of public education in New York. By 2022, the REACH Coalition, which was led by so many awesome organizations such as like CACF, OCA New York, SIC Coalition, the Korean American Civic Engagement, MCN, and other steering members, it was formed to push this initiative forward. The coalition's advocacy played a critical role in reintroducing the bill in 2023 with revised language, and these revisions explicitly named the key themes and topics that an AANHPI curriculum would include, such as contributions, structures, and policies that limited AANHPI advancement, instances of cross-community solidarity, and moments of significant social and political progress. The amended bill passage through the Senate in 2023 and 2024. It marks a significant step forward, and this progress underscores the importance of continued advocacy to ensure meaningful implementation of inclusive curriculum in our schools. You can go to the next slide, and just some wins to share. Kulsum has mentioned, our amazing senator and assembly member has also mentioned, we've successfully advocated for more precise and inclusive bill language over the last couple of years. We've organized amazing advocacy days. We've had advocates from all across New York, early in the morning, drive up all the way to Albany, meet with so many legislative offices, so many advocates and organizations who have been part of from press conferences to meeting with legislators, whether it's students or teachers or just community advocates. It's been amazing. And we've also doubled the number of co-sponsors in the Senate and Assembly between 2021 to 2024, which is no small feat. And just to throw a number out there, they're currently in REACH Coalition. We have 60 plus organizations and 150 plus advocates helping to champion these bills. So go REACH. And I'll pass it on to my awesome colleague, Hermeet.
Thanks, Sableen, and hello, everybody. I'm so excited to join y'all today to talk a little bit about the REACH Coalition's work. As we move into the next legislative session in New York State, I wanted to share just a little bit of high-level strategy focus that the REACH Coalition is prioritizing as we approach January. So we want to make sure that our advocacy continues to be intersectional, intergenerational, and statewide. So we, as we have discussed, New York City is its own beast in many ways. And while 40% of the state's population is located in the city, there's a diversity of AANHPI student, parent, and educator experiences across the state, and want to make sure that those experiences are uplifted as much as possible in our advocacy as a coalition. And as Kulsum laid out very eloquently earlier, as we did our landscape analysis, it is so important for us to not just focus our energy on the legislative advocacy, but also understand that engaging with the state education department, with local schools and districts, and even getting into the nitty-gritty of developing the curriculum and evaluating current curricular resources is an important part of this journey. That passing legislation is not the only avenue that we should be considering and can be considering, and that we should be investing our time and energy into other avenues as well. Oh, I had one last point on that last slide, sorry. And While we continue to build intersectional solidarity within AANHPI communities and across many communities, this Hearts and Minds work is really important for us to understand what it means for students to have access to this kind of curriculum, particularly someone coming from a South Asian and Sikh background, knowing that a curriculum like this is possible in New York State would mean that students in K through 12 right now would have a very, very different experience from the one that I had in school in the early 2000s. Next slide, please. So I'm going to quickly breeze through this. We've talked at length about kind of the different avenues that we are taking in our advocacy, and Gulsum has already talked about a lot of this. I did want to uplift Ari's curriculum project and a lot of the really important curriculum development and evaluation work that they are doing in partnership with the REACH Coalition and with CACF to make sure that the resources that we are developing outside of our legislative advocacy are also robust in their own way and reflective of the communities that we're serving. And also wanting to just uplift the fact that there are a number of curricular resources already existing, and that's a huge part of Ari's work and the REACH Coalition's work is evaluating the present landscape of AANHPI curricular resources around the country. The Asian American Education Project is doing amazing work. We talked earlier about the Hidden Voices curriculum in New York City. That is also an amazing body of curricular support resources. And we've already talked a little bit about the local advocacy, but from y'all's perches in kind of local communities, if you are a parent or connected with families who have students in K through 12 public school systems, there is direct local advocacy that we can and should be doing on that level to make sure that such a curriculum is put forth in our schools. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the upcoming work that the REACH Coalition is going to be embarking on with our amazing bill sponsors. We are proposing to our bill sponsors this upcoming session a couple of amendments that would strengthen these bills, particularly around the implementation and reporting piece. So we want to make sure that schools and districts have the opportunity at the outset, once the bill passes, to be able to share what they are and are not currently able to do or doing around enacting AANHPI curriculum. What resources do they need from the commissioner to be able to make such a curriculum possible? What resources do they already have? And we want to make sure that there are mechanisms for districts to continue to report as we move through the implementation phase of the curriculum. So how is the curriculum being implemented? Is it being implemented on the district and school level? What further resources are teachers and administrators going to need from the state in order to strengthen the curriculum as time goes on? We want to be sure that the legislation and the curriculum that comes from the legislation is in conversation with NYSED's own academic standards for social studies and the CRSE framework, both of which Gulsum mentioned earlier in the presentation. These are standards that the state sets for all schools. We want to make sure that the curriculum abides by those standards and the culturally responsive and sustaining education framework. We also want to make sure that community-based organizations like the 60+ organizations that are members of the REACH Coalition, as well as many others, and subject matter experts have an in into making sure that the curriculum itself is robust and representative. And I wanted to emphasize particularly, especially in light of Senator Liu's earlier remarks, helpfully naming some disparate views and advocacy from members of the AANHPI community in New York around curriculum advocacy. The REACH Coalition has had many conversations with public school teachers across New York State and other states where our member organizations are doing this kind of work. After evaluating the political landscape in the state and learning from other curricular efforts across the country, we are moving towards not mandating AANHPI curriculum in New York City, or New York State rather. And that language basically looks like in the bill, rather than a must enact this curriculum, it's a shall enact this curriculum. We're much more concerned about about making sure that a responsible and impactful curriculum development effort and implementation are the kind of focus of the conversation here, and focus of curriculum implementation for AANHPI communities. As we think about in New Jersey, for instance, this mandated curriculum that was passed through legislation, that a mandate alone and that one word of must is not a given for the implementation to, one, happen on the individual school and in district level, or that it's happening responsibly. So we want to make sure that we have avenues within the bill language itself to make sure that there is responsible implementation and accountability on the school, district, and state levels. And making sure that we are able to do that while also keeping issues like teacher autonomy in mind, and as well as access to resources for teachers and schools. And I'm going to breeze through this slide super quickly because I know we're a little bit past time. But these are a few of the goals that we have for the upcoming legislative session as a coalition. We want to make sure that we're supporting broader inclusive curriculum efforts on the legislative and agency fronts, particularly those led by non-AANHPI communities. We want to make sure that we're able to host a legislative briefing for state elected officials to continue to garner support for our legislation. We hope to see you all at our 3rd annual Advocacy Day coming up in the new year. And we have other opportunities to make sure that our coalition's work is more visible in front of individual communities in New York State, and that we're able to uplift your community and individual stories around AANHPI education efforts in public schools for our audiences at the REACH Coalition as well. So I'll stop there, and thank you all so much for taking a moment to listen to our coalition strategy. I'll pass it back to our CACF colleagues for closing.
Thank you so much, Harmeet and Sableen. And thank you all for staying a couple minutes over. Promise this is the last of it, and really appreciate you all again. We just want to kind of recap what we heard today, to share that, like, you know, we're mobilizing folks, we're bringing folks together. We want to say this is not the end, this is the beginning. And if there's like a few things we can hope that you all leave this session with, it's one, understanding that there's a lot of different ways to approach this advocacy, and that our goal at CACF, at REACH, is to ensure that every classroom every student can experience an inclusive curriculum, and every educator is equipped to actually teach that curriculum. And so, you know, legislation is one way to do this, but we also know it requires a very robust strategy, which we hope we've shared some of the key like stakeholders we hope to engage with to make that promise true. The other thing is that the fight for inclusive curriculum is not just one thing. It's not like one textbook that we're printing out and we're sending to everyone. Inclusive curriculum is really just like an expansive process. It's this idea, and that's not to like put it in this like utopian category to say it's not possible. It's 100% possible. I believe that. And to say that it can be done in various different ways. And the ultimate goal is coming back to that CRSC, that students feel a culturally responsive experience in the classroom. And this looks like different curricular resources accessible to them in different ways. And then the last point is that we absolutely will not be able to move this forward. We have quite a lot of evidence to point to that direction, that we will not be able to make this happen unless we're all doing this together, unless we're all like very united in our strategy and supporting one another's work, both within the AANHPI community, but also, as I noted and mentioned, there's a lot of different curricular efforts happening at the state level across communities, and it's going to be really important for us to do this fight together and support one another. And so those are kind of the wrap. As promised, we went 5 minutes over, and I apologize for that. But I believe in the chat, we've shared 2 forms, and we really hope, and we'll recap in an email as well. One, if you're interested to join REACH Coalition, we'll share that form. And then 2 is a quick feedback form. If you have any questions, thoughts that are coming up right now that you want to ask us, but I know we're over time, so we can't open the space, please put it there and we will get back to you with questions and thoughts that you have. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Appreciate Senator Liu, Assemblymember Lee, for joining us. Have a great day and look out for our email where we'll be sharing all of these resources you learned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone.